to waste another. Okay, now I'll go back into my screen and we'll go to, here we go. All right. So this week we're focusing on the flood narrative, which is basically Genesis 6, 7, 8, and then 9 is the mopping up after the flood. And that also means that in effect, we're coming with this week's work. We're coming to the end, as it were, of probably the first major section in the Pentateuch. Everything is different after the flood, and that is not just true of Genesis. Okay, the big theological point from this week is probably everything is always different after the flood. All of us who are alive are living post-diluvian. We're all after the flood. None of us live in the circumstances pre-flood, which according to lots of ancient traditions, not just those in the Bible, people lived on average to pretty close to 1,000 years. How they managed to fund themselves through their retirement for 950 years is something of a minor miracle. I guess they had extended families and they bludged off the kids. But then after 1,000 years, you'd have so many children and grandchildren, you would never remember their birthdays. So, you know, clearly the nature of this material from before the flood is a different kind of story world than the story world after the flood, where people more or less lived for normal kind of life cycles. So, so this, by the time we get to chapter 9, we've kind of finished saying what's the status of the universe from creation and the Eden story, and then the story of the flood. That in a sense, the stage has been set for what's going to follow. In chapter 10 with the Tower of Babel, but then once we get into the story of Abraham and beyond. So this week is a really interesting kind of moment in not only in Genesis, but in our work together in this course, okay? Excuse me. So I thought we'd start, and throughout this session, what I'm wanting us to do is to reflect on our own experiences of flood as well. And if you haven't had floods in your life, perhaps think about bushfires. And if you haven't had bushfires, perhaps think about cyclones. You know, there are any number of natural disasters, in a sense, that to which the flood story might talk and connect in some way. This particular image is my old high school in Lismore, which I learned more about. I'd always thought that the older timber buildings on the left-hand side of that photo, which we used to call A Block, I'd always had in my head that that was the old North Lismore Public School, primary school. In fact, it's the old Lismore High School, which was then turned into the North Lismore Primary School and then subsequently turned into Rishon River High School. And those newer buildings with the metal roofs are the ones that were kind of going up in the 60s and early 70s. And had I stayed in Lismore, I would have been in the class of 69. So I was there 63, 64, 65, 66, 67 sort of thing. That's just one snapshot of the devastation caused by a flood, which can be quite, quite dramatic. Sometimes floods are just a little bit of water that's come up out of the storm drain, and we get them around here in Milton all the time. Maybe not so much now they've put one-way valves on the stormwater drains, but until quite recently, and certainly I think after 2011, we would often get flooding in Milton and Norman Park and so on, just with high tides, especially a spring tide. All the stormwater drains would back up. That's an inconvenience. What we got in Brisbane in 74 and 2011, what Lismore got last year, and probably what North Queensland is getting at the moment, is a devastating flood. And And that's part of our lived experience in this part of Australia. And probably, except for maybe the coastal rivers in far north Queensland, where they don't really flood because there's not really a floodplain. To have a flood, you need a floodplain, basically, in a river that's got a long, windy kind of valley that's making its way through. So we will have either some experience of flooding, or we'll have an experience of some other natural disaster where the power of nature is just overwhelming, and it just blows away whatever we think we put in place that we were so proud of. Now, that's probably not the point of the flood story in Genesis, but I think it's one of the points we draw from that story as we reflect on that story from the safe vantage point of, thousands of years later in a totally different place. And certainly, I mean, I've just started back in Lismore a week or so ago as the locum at St Andrew's Church, and the town is still full of broken homes, broken shops, and hurting people. And big questions over what's the future of this community. Do we all move to Austinville and just rename it as Lismore? I mean, what do you do when you realise? And what do you do when you realised, the Indigenous people were right 150 years ago when they told the Catholics who bought that ridge where St Carthage's Cathedral is, not as high as the hill where St Andrews is, but they actually said, big water comes over that hill. Oh, yeah, sure. We'll be fine. We know what we're doing. We're British. Well, big water came over the hill in this time last year, and the Catholic Cathedral was chest deep in water. Okay. So there are lessons to be learned, I guess, in those experiences. And of course, there are lessons to be learned. Somebody thought there were lessons to be learned by telling this story, which as we will already have seen from some of the work you've been doing, this was not a story that had never been told before in the Middle East. This was a story that's been around. By the time we find it in Genesis, it's already been around for a few thousand years in one version or another. And some Jewish, inverted commas, storyteller thought this is a story we need to tell. And we need to put this story inside the framework of covenant, and which is, of course, what they're doing by the end of that process. So that's going to be our dominant kind of theme, as it were, today. So looking ahead at where we're going to be thinking about how stories are told, how narratives are shaped. We're going to be particularly reflecting on different aspects of the flood. There will be opportunities to think about our own response to flood stories. And as I said in church the Sunday before last, which was sort of the weekend, it was the anniversary of the flood, I was so glad that Genesis 6, 7, 8 was not the Old Testament reading that week. That would have been a very difficult conjunction of text and context. We're going to be thinking a fair bit about source criticism, but remembering the source criticism processes we're talking about are source criticism, but it's using older material within an oral culture, which is very different from copying and pasting in a digital world. And it's very different from having a library full of books, and like I've got the J book here and I've got the P book here, and I'm blending them together, which I'm quite sure never actually happened. So what's the significance of source criticism when we're dealing with material from an oral culture? And even when writing is invented, writing is like your backup copy. Nobody's interested in the written text. It's there if you need it. Everybody has it up here, and that's part of that culture. I'm going to introduce you to a concept developed by Thomas Thompson, which he calls the traditional complex chain narrative. We'll spend a bit of time on that later. We'll reflect a little bit, not necessarily in this order, on hermeneutics, which of course it's just another word for, well, exegesis is one way of doing hermeneutics. Anytime we hear a text, read a text, and form an opinion about what it means, we have just done hermeneutics. Well or badly, but we've done hermeneutics, okay? And a lot of the time, getting ready for sermons, you won't have time to go through a 25-step exegetical process in order to work on your sermon, let alone to do it for all 3 readings. So a lot of the time, what we get ready for our congregations is going to be hopefully well informed, but not in depth exegesis and of course hermeneutics. So we'll talk about that. We'd maybe talk a bit more about word studies and using accordance the best we can if we have time for that as well. So for those of us that are still struggling to get accordance configured or whatever, I don't want to be using up too much of our 3-hour block just doing accordance seminars. So we might just have to, as I've just said to Jerry before, we can make a time when I can Zoom with a person, or we can make a time I can Zoom with 2 or 3 people that just want to walk through a couple of things. And we'll do it outside the Tuesday afternoon, or else we'll be stuck in the mud and we'll never make enough progress. Okay, and we are doing our first of our oral presentations is going to happen, and that's also source criticism. So today is brought to you by source criticism and the flood. Okay. Okay. So thinking back over the material from last week, and just how the unit is going so far, what questions, observations do people have? I'm going to try shrinking this down, which means I've got to leave the other windows up, but that's okay. And then bring this back up as well. Are there any points generally about how the subject is going, or any points specifically about the material from last week, while I try to bring my Zoom thing back up?
I think it's just been very eye-opening around sort of refocusing my mindset anyway on a few things around where this narrative all came from.
Yeah.
The sources I was completely unaware of. I didn't take any literal reading of it.
Can people hear, Lyd? You've got the magic talking cube in front of you. Yep. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, so it's just been interesting to get my head around I guess how these scriptures came about, and
no, but that's certainly something I'm still finding interesting and challenging, unresolved. One thing to say, Moses didn't write this, or that we can't really make a case that Moses wrote this.
Even when you were saying about Abraham, like that was like I thought Abraham was a person. That's what I heard you say. It wasn't. It's more like the families and the.
Yeah, well, remember the personal anecdote that when I was at the Church of Christ College in Melbourne, having already dropped out of the Church of Christ College in Brisbane because I found it way too fundamentalist. So I went down to Melbourne thinking I was very broad-minded, and I was deeply shocked to find there were 2nd and 3rd year students who just took it as granted that Abraham was some sort of mythic character that didn't actually exist. And that really profoundly, churned me up, and kind of it's challenging information for us to process depending what our previous spiritual journey has been, I guess. And the couple that I was closest to during that first year that I was down at College of the Bible came up to visit me a couple of years later when I was a student here. I remember walking around the drive showing Jeff the place, and he said, and his comment was, "So, Jenks, do you still think Abraham existed?" I went, "Oh, let's not go there," kind of thing.
I remember you telling me.
But it's it's a journey.
Yeah.
And the goalposts keep moving.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can say when it was written,
Mm.
And even if it wasn't put together until, say, let's say 250 BC or something, that doesn't mean the material was first created at that stage, because there's lots of old stuff here.
Mm.
And it's like they're building a house using a lot of recycled materials from other homesteads.
Mm.
And so when you find what looks like a mantelpiece from the Victorian period, it probably is a mantelpiece from the Victorian period, but that doesn't mean that this house is from the Victorian period.
Mm.
It's the same sort of thing with the Pentateuch. It's old, and it goes back, more than 2,000 years. Probably doesn't go back 3,000 years. But beyond that, I'm not sure we can have much more precision.
Fascinating, the whole.
And then you've got to live with that
Around it all. Mm.
kind of ambiguity about what sort of text is this and
Yeah.
what is the relationship with history. As I said, in the case of the flood, this is a story that's been around for several thousand years that we know of from ancient copies. So long before the Old Testament is being put, long before the book of Genesis is being put together, people in the ancient Near East, but I would say not Palestine, because Palestine doesn't have floods, are telling these stories about giant floods.
Mm.
And then whoever is putting Genesis together, let's call her the Yahwist, but I mean, who knows, says this is a really, we all know this story. Let's make this a story about Yahweh imposing order on a world which is out of control. Yeah, so, but when did that happen? And I guess one of the answers from scholars would normally be during the exile, because until then, there were no Jewish people embedded in the culture of Mesopotamia. And that's where those stories come from. So unless there's some exposure. So this goes to the question of parallels. And a parallel is simply two events, two documents, two ideas, whatever, which look remarkably similar. But parallel doesn't mean influence. Some things do happen independently. Okay. So the COVID virus at the moment is independently following the same pattern of mutation in Australia as it is doing in other places around the world, because that's what the virus does. We're no longer importing, in a sense, significant COVID variations. We're making our own. And they're the same as the variations popping up spontaneously in other parts of the world, because that's what the virus does in response to effective vaccines, public health measures. It then has to find other ways to multiply and keep on regenerating itself. So there's been a lot of enthusiasm at one stage in biblical studies. If you found a parallel, then that meant this bit of the Bible was borrowed from there. No, not necessarily.
Yeah, I heard there were flood stories everywhere from ancient Norse to dreaming to North America.
Well, that's what that book.
Like you're talking
yeah,
something 1 to X number of things were similar enough that you could say there was some sort of global flood myth.
Sure, and this would get us into genre criticism, form criticism, and people will say, in a miracle story, there's a genre, there's a particular form. You get told what the problem is, then the prophet or the healer does something. Step 3, the person is healed. Step 4, everybody goes, wow, what a great guy this is. Well, how else can you tell?
Adventure narrative.
How else can you tell? Like the hero goes on adventure, he's going to overcome certain obstacles. Some people will help, some people will oppose him. So in the case of floods, and the book by Alan Dundas, which is referenced, it's referenced in the slides coming up. You can download it as an ebook, and there's a maximum number of people can have it at a time, or you can buy your own copy for $193 from Amazon. But I did notice we don't have a copy in the library. Might have a chat with the librarian later. Although at that price, it had to be a very sweet chat. So what that is, it's a book edited by Alan Dundas, and he's got chapters written by scholars of of folklore and scripture and different faith traditions and skeptics and what have you, looking at how the great flood myth, in the truly archetypal sense of the word myth, a story that everybody knows and it may never have happened, but it's like the myth of Aussie mateship. You know, it's something real, even if you don't see it. So, and I'm sure that's part of the data that's in there. It's a great collection of data put together in the mid 1980s from memory. But then it said, what's a flood? I mean, there's no way the people in Palestine would have told flood stories. Their problem was the sea, not floods.
When Atlantis sunk, there was a tidal wave.
Well, that's tsunamis, and yeah, those things did happen, whether it's Atlantis or not, and whether Atlantis is somewhere off Turkey or whether it's somewhere off Spain. I've got a friend who died recently. He's quite convinced he'd found Atlantis.
What does he reckon?
I think he has off Spain from memory, but he's died, so I can't check that with him. Without doing stuff we don't do in church circles. Come in, Richard. But yes, I mean, the explosions that took place in the Mediterranean, particularly the Aegean area, around about 1400 BCE, massive tidal surges. We've got the remains of those tsunamis up in the mountains of Turkey, hundreds of kilometers away from the coast. And it totally changed civilization. It destroyed the late Bronze Age culture. And actually, more than Joshua, that's what allowed the Israelites to emerge and take over Canaan or Palestine, because the big cities collapsed, the trade structures collapsed, the economy went bad because of this massive volcanic explosion and tidal wave. So what happened in Fiji last year or whatever was nothing compared with this amazing explosion. So the trouble is we know so much more about science and history, and geology, DNA. We're not necessarily any smarter. We're not necessarily any better as good people. We don't seem to have the wisdom to live well in the world, but we know that these stories can't be taken literally, and yet we can see them popping up in so many places around the world, because there's, like my intro before, about we're all on this side of some disaster, whether it's a flood or a bushfire or a hurricane or Cyclone Tracy or, you know, whatever it happens to have been. And those events mark people. Now, I've got friends who still go all creeped out when they hear the cyclone warning siren that was used back in the 70s, which we've stopped using for exactly that reason. People had a post-traumatic stress reaction to hearing that alarm, so we don't use that sound anymore. And so and everything that's happening in the history of Judaism and Christianity and Islam or whatever is after the flood. Yeah, but they all have these stories, and they're particularly big stories in cultures that are based on when you've got a society or a culture like Egypt based in the Nile, like Babylon, Sumer, and so on, based in Mesopotamia, and like the Indus Valley and so on. Those, and I'm sure if we knew enough about the traditions, there'd be similar stories from China, from the Yangtze River and the Yellow River and so on, because from time to time they flood. And the indigenous people, like the indigenous people in Lismore, when the Catholics bought the land for St. Carthage's Cathedral, they knew you don't build on that hill because it's not high enough. Sometimes big water come over that hill. So and that of course is oral tradition, oral knowledge, cultural knowledge. And now it's been woven into a post-flood white narrative about how we should have listened to the blackfellas. Okay, so but there's a source. There's a source embedded in the way people in Lismore are now talking about indigenous knowledge that we should have listened to. But it's a modern story with an ancient element. Yeah, so flood stories and other kinds of catastrophes, depending on I guess the sort of geology and geography of the place, are found in across many, many cultures, but you'd be hard pressed to say that. That's assuming there. I'm sure there are flood narratives from central USA from pre-European times, from the Pueblo Indians or whatever. But it's very difficult to demonstrate how those flood stories could in any way be a source for Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9.
I don't think that is.
There's no cultural historical continuity. Whereas with the Mesopotamian flood stories, they're not only incredibly similar at the point of detail, but they're from the right part of the world. And we happen to know, or we think we know, that because of the exile, the elite, the educated elite of Judah spent a few decades at least in Babylon. So kind of circle closes. Doesn't tell us when exactly or who. So it's that kind of stuff. Okay. Anything else out of last week? Because we're up to the 30-minute mark. We should really flick on to something different at this stage, unless there's something there we still want to work on. Okay. Sorry, I don't fast forward the Zoom meeting. That's what I would do on the PowerPoint, isn't it? Okay. So let's go. I'm going to go back into my screen sharing, which means I won't be able to see your attractive faces quite as much. We'll make it. We're big people. Okay. And I'm not going to hit the play button. It'll take up the whole screen. Whereas this way I might. Oh, I guess it doesn't matter. Yes, here we go. I can still see you there if I'm hold my tongue the right way. Okay. Yeah. So we've looked at the thing about questions out of last week. Let's come back. In a sense, we've already started on this, which is fine. Notice, by the way, the nice little graphic down there probably looks better on the screen than it does here on the piece of plastic. So the points I'm making there is that, first of all, Palestine is not a flood zone. It's not the kind of geography that has floods. There are between the central hill country and the Mediterranean, there are half a dozen streams, but they're streams. They're little creeks, and they're quite short running. So it's sort of like far north Queensland, short rivers from the hill straight to the ocean. What you do have in Palestine, of course, is the Jordan River, and before modern technology changed the flow of the water, you'd get a major flood in the Jordan Valley at the end of winter every year, which means January, February every year is the flood season. And so in order to make the miracle of Joshua crossing the Jordan even bigger, the story makes the point that he's doing it at that time of year, because actually it's not that hard to cross the Jordan when it's not flooding. Okay. Now at the baptism site, Qasr Al Yahud, and towards the southern end of the Jordan River, as you go down on the Israeli side to the riverbank, there's a flood marker there from January 2013. When you're standing down on the bank of the river, that flood marker is at least 5 meters above me. Okay, so massive amounts of water in the Jordan Valley for a few weeks. And that's why the Jordan keeps changing its course in that marshy swampland. And the international border between Israel and Jordan keeps shifting because the River Jordan keeps redefining where the river is. But floods famously occur in Egypt and Mesopotamia, both of which are critical places for the biblical world. And in the Nile, in the case of the Nile, the Egyptian economy was based around the beneficial effects of the flood, which was managed and, in a sense, water harvested, and silt and fertilizer harvested in a way that the engineers at Ivanhoe Dam weren't able to do in 2011, apparently. So, and again, I think it's always good to keep in mind that Palestine, by default, is the northeast province of Egypt. Okay, it's been like that forever. Up to the mountains, basically what we call the sort of Lebanese mountains. So to the headwaters of the Jordan River, Banias, Caesarea Philippi, that sort of area, Mount Hermon, that's the natural footprint for Egypt when things are going well politically and military in Egypt. When things are not going so well, two things happen. Either the little towns and kingdoms or whatever in Palestine become independent and you just get fragmentation when there's no major power. Alternatively, there is another major power and it's coming from the north. It's either going to be Turkey, or in today's terms, it's either Turkey or Iraq. And the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, which is a very Eurocentric name. So the Eastern Mediterranean is traditionally dominated either by Egypt, Turkey, or Iraq.
Is that related to how there's so much in the Old Testament about how I told you not to go and ask him about?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And that's the pro-Babylon faction saying, don't go talking to the Jippos. Okay. Because Palestine, and even if you think through to the sort of Seleucid period after the death of Alexander the Great, so he knocks off the Persian Empire, okay. But then he dies after a drinking bout, gets a cold, doesn't wake up in the morning, whatever. So the kingdom, the empire gets split. So the Ptolemies, the general called Ptolemy, gets the area from the Lebanese mountains down to Egypt, because that's the Egyptian bit by default. Seleucus gets Lebanon, Syria, Mesopotamia, and as far east as he thinks he can manage. Okay. And there's another one which is based more on Greece. I can't think of his name, but he's not a big player in the long haul. So what happens with the Battle of Banias in 199 BCE is that the Seleucid kingdom pushes the Ptolemies back, and the border moves from Banias, Caesarea Philippi, the border moves effectively to Gaza. Okay. And it's only 150 Ks. But that's the Egyptian sphere of influence in Palestine when things are going their way. And I remember also there's a massively significant Jewish diaspora community in Alexandria, in the Delta, in the Nile River. And there's another massive Jewish diaspora in Babylon, which will eventually produce the Babylonian Talmud. So, you know, they're there for hundreds of years. Okay. So there's these huge cultural kind of dynamics going on. As I mentioned, and Paul has already alluded to it as well in the material that he shared, there's an extensive discussion of all this and a collection of sort of raw material, if you like, in the essays edited by Alan Dudess in 1988. And looking at the type font, I realized straight away it was a book from that period because it's been produced straight from his typewriter. You can see how the manuscript is, but the eyes of an editor can see what's going on there. Source criticism of a kind, but to do with font. So that's worth checking out. And that link there, the archive.org, that's a link from which you can download a copy of the Dundas book if you're wanting to. Again, it's you could spend the rest of your life just unpacking the stuff we're going to skip over in the next 3 months. So you've got to choose the things that are of interest and of relevance to you and your ministry. Similarly, you can read the online. For example, the next link is just a link to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we keep hearing about, but mostly we don't bother. So because I've changed to a different app, I've got to redo the screen. All right, take this one. I'll have this sorted out by the end of May. And there were two things about this resource. Yeah, that's exactly why, because of this thing here, which I can close by the look of it. This is, again, this happened last week. These are resources that have been put together for school teachers. Yeah, there's some really good stuff here that we could use in parish Bible studies or in sermon preparation or background work or whatever. In this case, it's a set of literary charts that document the contents and provide a brief commentary, in this case, on the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it just goes through the story and shows the similarities and the differences between. I mean, at a sort of trivial level, the problem in the Babylonian flood myth was the humans were making so many babies, they were keeping the gods up at night and they couldn't sleep. Okay. Well, you know,
I get it.
it's an anthropomorphic view of gods. Okay, they need their sleep, and if they don't get sleep, they're worse than a 2-year-old. You know, so look after the gods, keep them happy. That's part of the spiritual wisdom of Babylon, if you like. Of course, in the biblical world, the issue is not they're too noisy or there's too many of them. The issue is their wickedness, their behavior is so bad, and God could only find one righteous man on the entire, well, we'd say planet, but of course that's not a word they would have used. And in the world, could only find one righteous man. But that was good enough for his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives to all come along for the ride.
It's all the more the better.
Oh, and it's about multiply, be bountiful, fill the earth, and so on. So there's a different dynamic going on here. But it's like when, say, politicians might invoke the Robin Hood story and perhaps position themselves as Robin Hood, and they don't ever position themselves as being the Sheriff of Nottingham, of course. But I mean, it's a story that everybody knows. So when it's alluded to, I see what you're trying to do. So presumably some version of this story was well known in literary circles in ancient Judah, at least during the exile period. And so by the version we then get in the Old Testament is certainly cleaned up, and it reflects Jewish sensibilities, the idea there's only one God and so on. But even at the end of the Gilgamesh epic, they offer a sacrifice, and it actually says the gods gathered like flies at a barbecue. Okay, the smell of the sacrifice brought the gods like flies at a picnic. In the book of Genesis, Noah offers a sacrifice and God comes. So I mean, there's still so much stuff in there which has been cleaned up, but it's not a brand new story. There's a fair bit of sharing and other things going on. Let me go back into my screen. Last week I had 2 lovely big screens, but I'm not sure it actually made it any easier. It's just trying to juggle PowerPoint plus Zoom at the same time is an interesting challenge.
Somebody could do a better job. I don't believe you.
There's another interesting article. This it goes back a long way. As in 1970, my first year out of school. But it's an article from Catholic Biblical Quarterly, actually looking at the Gilgamesh epic and the Genesis flood story. Again, you'll find the same stuff in every commentary, in every any article anywhere that discusses the flood. You're going to have this. So what we've just been doing is an example of going behind the text. So okay, we've got a flood story here. We're going to go behind the text, and we're going to see who else was telling stories like this, and what kind of physical world did they live in? Was it a flood-prone place? Like, I mean, again, because I'm a Lismore kid, I grew up knowing the stories of the floods, even the ones that I wasn't there for. Okay, and we would have floods twice a year because they hadn't built the levee yet. February, you got a week off school. July, you got a week off school. Then you went back the week after, and there's no major drama. But when you build a levee, and then the water comes over the levee, instead of being water slowly rising, it's rushing water with multi-billions of gallons of water behind it, roaring through town, knocking everything over. And I was told the flood last year, there was the normal murky, disgusting flood water. But on top of that was more than a meter of perfectly clean rainwater. there was so much rain falling on top of the flood that it didn't even mix. Okay? I mean, this is deluge. This is flood. This is the waters above the heavens and the waters below the heavens, and you know, it's coming in from everywhere. So you can imagine the kind of story that's going on. All right, now let me do something a little bit different. We tend to talk about the Bible all the time. I thought I'd actually read it to you. We break it up into bits and pieces. So I'm going to read it. I haven't actually practiced this translation, but it should be okay, I hope. So I'm reading from the what's called the 5 Books of Moses, new translation with introduction and commentary and notes by Everett Fox. You may have set it up. There's 2 or 3 copies up in the library, one less at the moment because it's down here. But while I'm mentioning that, let me mention a couple of other resources. This one is available as a, I think, as an accordance module. I'm pretty sure it's an accordance module. It's a commentary. It's the text and the commentary. It's just called The Torah, a Modern Commentary, edited by Gunther Plaut. It's basically, in many ways, it's like a lectionary book or a gospel book, but it gives you the text, but it also gives you all sorts of commentary, and then it has what are called gleanings. It'll go through other traditional Jewish sources where this material. So if you wanted to get into the way that the Genesis story is being reprocessed and reflected on in sort of Jewish communities, that's a really good book, even though it's like probably, yeah, it's probably more than 40 years old.
That's a Jewish.
Yeah, it's just called The Torah. Again, I'm sure there's a copy upstairs, and I think I have it in accordance as well, from memory. But it's a fantastic way of getting inside the Jewish skin, as it were. But bearing in mind, it's a modern Jewish commentary, so it's a Jewish scholar who's a modern biblical critic. It's not orthodox. It's not ultra orthodox. It's not Hasidim. It's a kind of Jewish scholar who could teach at our seminary without being offended or offensive. A couple of other books I brought down from the library because of the topic. This is a book by Anthony Campbell, who for many years was a Jesuit scholar in Melbourne at the Catholic Theological College in Melbourne. And he wrote this book on sources of the Pentateuch. That was his big thing. And so, yeah, he's a bolted on source critic. And if I'm remembering it correctly, no, it's the other ones. He's just simply got the J document and the E document and the P document all there for you. So what Paul shared earlier is the kind of thing you'll find in Campbell. And this one, with the wonderful title, The Bible with Sources Revealed. Okay. It actually has the text of the Bible color-coded, very much like that piece that Paul shared. So just by looking at a page, once you know the color code, there's yellow and blue and italics and what have you, you get a visual sense. And I kind of apologized to Matt earlier that I didn't think of mentioning these resources, but it's the same old stuff. But if you're really interested in source criticism, it's the way to go. In that year that I spent in Melbourne, of course, we ran into JEDP very quickly in the Old Testament course. I'd been taught to hate JEDP at Kenmore Christian College, but I had to learn it properly when I was down there with all these smart people. So I remember going home, and I was the student minister at Brighton Church of Christ, and they had lots of leftover Bibles in the vestry. So I went across and got an armful of little Bibles, and I got a clean exercise book, and I cut up the Bible. I cut up all the sections, JEP, and I pasted them continuously. I made my own version of this, basically. Now I wouldn't agree with it at all, but it was a hands-on learning task that meant I really, literally came to grips with source criticism. and was quite persuaded by it at the time.
That Torah book, I'm pretty sure that's in close reserve. I'm sure I had a glance at that the other day.
Yeah.
That one. Downstairs.
Yeah, I'm sure there's one of those.
Close reserve, yeah.
It's a great book. There are lots of books I'll throw out as I move more into retirement, but that won't be one of them, even though it's a bit long in the tooth. So before we change gear, let me just simply read the story of the flood so that we hear it as one continuous story. And I'm going to start at chapter 5, verse 32, because that's where I'll just go with whatever chapter breaks and so on is provided. When Noah was 500 years old, Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now it was when humans first became many on the face of the soil. Actually, that's an interesting leftover from the Babylonian story. There are lots of them. And they first became many on the face of the soil, and women were born to them, presumably they were already, that the divine beings saw how beautiful the human women were, and so they took to themselves wives whomever they chose. And Yahweh said, my rushing spirit shall not remain in humankind for ages, for they too are flesh. Let their days then be 120 years. The giants were on earth in those days, and afterwards as well, when the divine beings came into the human women and they bore them children. They were the heroes who were of former ages, the men of name. And Yahweh saw that great was humankind's evil doing on earth, and every form of their heart's planning was only evil all the day. Then Yahweh was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it pained his heart. Yahweh said, I will blot out humankind whom I have created from the face of the soil, from man to beast, to crawling thing, and to the fowl of the heavens, for I'm sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. These are the begettings, that's Toledot, this one, down to next week or the week after. These are the begettings, the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous, wholehearted man in his generation. In accord with God did Noah walk. Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth had gone to ruin before God. The earth was filled with wrongdoing. God saw the earth, and here it had gone to ruin, for all flesh had ruined its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, an end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with wrongdoing through them. Yeah, I'm about to bring ruin upon them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. With reeds make the ark, and cover it within and without with a covering of pitch. And this is how you are to make it. 300 cubits the length of the ark, 50 cubits its breadth, and 30 cubits its height. A skylight you are to make for the ark, finishing it to a cubit upwards. The entrance of the ark you are to set in its side, with a lower, a second, and a third deck you are to make it. As for me, here I am, about to bring on the deluge, water upon the earth, to bring ruin upon all flesh that has rush of life in it from under the heavens. All that is on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you. You are to come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. From all living things, from all flesh, you are to bring 2 from all into the ark to remain alive with you. They are to be a male and a female each. From fowl after their kind, from herd animals after their kind, from all crawling things of the soil after their kind, 2 from all are to come to you to remain alive. As for you, take for yourself from all edible things that are eaten and gather it to you. It shall be for you and for them for eating. Noah did it. According to all that God commanded, so he did. Yahweh said to Noah, "Come, you and all your household into the ark, for you I have seen as righteous before me in this generation. From all ritually pure animals you are to take 7 and 7 each, a male and his mate. And for all animals that are not pure, 2 each, a male and his mate. And also from the fowl of the heavens, 7 and 7 each, male and female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. For yet in 7 days I will make it rain upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and will blot out all existing things that I have made from the face of the soil." Noah did it, according to all that Yahweh had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the deluge occurred, water upon the earth. And Noah came, his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark before the waters of the deluge. From the pure animals and from the animals that are not pure, and from the fowl and all that crawls about on the soil, 2 and 2 each came to Noah into the ark, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. After the 7 days, it was that the waters of the deluge were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd new moon, on the 17th day after the new moon, on that day, then burst all the well springs of the great ocean, and the sluices of the heavens opened up. The torrent was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day came Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, and Noah's wife, and his 3 sons with them into the ark. They and all the wildlife after their kind, all the herd animals after their kind, all the crawling things that crawl upon the earth after their kind, all fowl after their kind, all chirping things, I love that, all winged things. They came to Noah in the ark, 2 and 2 each from all flesh, in which there is the rush of life. And those that came, male and female, from all flesh they came, as God had commanded him. As God had commanded him. Yahweh closed the door upon him. The deluge was 40 days upon the earth. The waters increased and lifted the ark, so that it was raised above the earth. The waters swelled and increased exceedingly upon the earth, so that the ark floated upon the face of the waters. When the waters had swelled exceedingly, yes, exceedingly over the earth, all high mountains that were under the heavens were covered. 15 cubits upwards swelled the waters, thus the mountains were covered. Then expired all flesh that crawls about on the earth, fowl, herd animals, wildlife, and all swarming things that swarm upon the earth, and all humans, all that had the breath of the rush of life in their nostrils, all that were on firm ground, died. He blotted out all existing things that were on the face of the soil, from man to beast, to crawling thing, and to fowl of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Noah alone remained, and those who were with him in the ark. The water swelled upon the earth for 150 days. But God paid mind to Noah and all living things, all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God brought a rushing wind across the earth, so that the waters abated. The well springs of ocean and the sluices of the heavens were dammed up, and the torrents from the heavens was held back. The waters returned from upon the earth, continually advancing and returning, and the waters diminished at the end of 150 days. And the ark came to rest in the 7th new moon, on the 17th day after the new moon, upon the mountains of Ararat. Now the waters continued to advance and diminish until the 10th new moon. On the 10th, on the first day of the new moon, the tops of the mountains could be seen. At the end of 40 days it was, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out a raven. It went off, going and returning until the waters were dried up from upon the earth. Then he sent out a dove from him to see whether the waters had subsided from the face of the soil. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot. So she returned to him in the ark, for there was water upon the face of all the earth. Then he sent forth his hand, and he took her and brought her to him into the ark. Then he waited yet another 7 days, sent out the dove yet again from the ark. The dove came back to him at eventide, eventime, here a freshly plucked olive leaf in her beak. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from upon the earth. Then he waited yet another 7 days and sent out the dove, but she returned to him again no more. And so it was in the 601st year, in the beginning month, on the first day of the new moon, that the waters left firm ground upon the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and saw, here the face of the soil was firm. Now on the second new moon, on the 27th day after the new moon, the earth was completely dry. God spoke to Noah and said, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons and your sons' wives with you, all living things that are with you, all flesh, fowl, animals, all crawling things that crawl about upon the earth. Have them go out with you, that they may swarm on earth, that they may bear fruit and become many upon the earth." So Noah went out, his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives with him, all the living things, all crawling things, and all fowl, all that crawl about upon the earth, according to their clans, they went out of the ark. Noah built a slaughter site to Yahweh. He took from all pure animals and from all pure fowl and offered up offerings upon the slaughter site. And when Yahweh smelled the soothing savor, Yahweh said in his heart, "I will never curse the soil again on humankind's account, since what the human heart forms is evil from its youth. I will never again strike down all living things as I've done. Never again, all the days of the earth, shall sowing and harvest, cold and wheat, summer and winter, day and night, ever cease." And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Bear fruit and be many and fill the earth. Fear of you, dread of you shall be upon all the wildlife of the earth, upon all the fowl of the heavens, all that crawls on the soil, all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. All crawling things that live, for you they shall be for eating. As with green plants, I now give you all. However, flesh with its life, its blood, you are not to eat. However, too, for your blood of your own lives, I will demand satisfaction. From all wild animals, I will demand it, and from humankind, from every man regarding his brother. I demand satisfaction for human life. Whoever now sheds human blood, for that human shall his blood be shed. For in God's image, he made humankind. And as for you, bear fruit and be many, swarm on earth and become many on it. God said to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, "As for me, here, I am about to establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with all living things that are with you, fowl, herd animals, all the wildlife of the earth with you, all those going out of the ark, of all the living things of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you. All flesh shall never be cut off again by waters of the deluge. Never again shall there be deluge to bring the earth to ruin." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I set between me and you, and all living things that are with you, for ageless generations. My bow I set in the clouds, so that it may serve as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be, When I becloud the earth with clouds, and in the clouds the bow is seen, I will call to mind my covenant that is between me and you and all living things, all flesh. Never again shall the waters become a deluge, to bring all flesh to ruin. When the bow is in the clouds, I will look at it to call to mind the age-old covenant between God and all living beings, all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. So my guess is that might have been the first time we've actually listened to the whole of the flood story being read as one continuous passage.
May I ask what the version? What?
That's his own translation.
Yeah. Okay. I know you said it up front, but I didn't realise because I'm following the NRSV and yeah. Thanks.
Yes, there are many different. There's a whole world of debate around translation, but this is one individual scholar, Everett Fox, doing his own translation and then interspersing commentary and notes and so on. Okay. As I was reading it through, I noticed several places which I was tempted to comment on about things that echo with other parts of the Pentateuch. So it talked about the strong wind that God sent to drive the waters back. And of course, in the Exodus story, it's a strong wind from the east that blows the waters back when they're crossing the sea. Certainly, there's a reference towards the end to the Genesis 1 creation story, and that you're to have dominion and all humankind and so on. So whoever is putting this together is familiar with the stuff that we call Genesis chapter 1, as well as perhaps some of the stuff we have in Exodus 14 or whatever. Okay. Anything else struck you as you heard it? I mean, there is certainly repetition. There's some redundancy in the way the story is told. And that's, of course, I'm sure Matt's going to, as we get into that conversation, we'll look at some of those details. And famously, various literally verses of Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9 are, or even half sentences are paired off to be given to another source.
Question, Greg.
Yeah.
Everett Fox, what's his date of birth, date of death, and the scholarship department did he come out of his circle?
I don't know if he's still alive. Okay, he's okay, the cataloguing and information doesn't give his birth date, but his father was 1906 to 1963.
Yeah.
Okay. You could just do a quick Google on him. It might. Okay, he holds the Alan M. Glick Chair in Judaic and Biblical Studies at Clark University, Worcester, Massachusetts, and he's also published a translation of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Okay. John Levinson, who was at Harvard Divinity School, said, "No serious Bible reader, whether Jewish or Christian, can afford to ignore this volume." How does that make you feel? Having probably never come across it. And Robert Outer, who was the famous The Art of Biblical Narrative, narrative guy, Fox's translation has the rare virtue of making constantly visible in English the Hebraic quality of the original, challenging preconceptions of what the Bible is really like, a bracing protest against the bland modernity of all the recent English versions of the Bible. I wonder what he really thought.
Elsa, yeah. He's got a cartoon for his book. It says that a woman says to it's time to take you out of my narrative.
Yeah, you can look in the break. You can look at the break.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Sorry, just wetting my throat. Part of what's in the background for that comment from Alta is that the versions that are designed to be read in church or even used in a home Bible study, but particularly read out in church, are kind of cleaned up translations that are suitable for a public audience. Okay. There are a number of features of the underlying Hebrew and Greek which just kind of get sandpapered off to make them a little bit more respectable. Okay. And that's one of the things when you actually start to study the text in the original languages, you notice all kinds of bumps and scratches that are there in the Greek or the Hebrew, which are kind of dealt with by the Bible Translation Committee. And they tend to be a committee, and they negotiate and they vote on the best way to kind of capture this for their audience. So Bible translation is very different from, if you've got the time and the interest, actually reading it in the original and forming your own view, which doesn't mean you're correct. It just means you get a different angle on the text.
Yeah, this rushing wind of life.
Yeah, I'd want to.
It's a really good contribution to. I mean, you do a lot on pneuma.
Yeah.
Testament stuff.
Yes.
But it still has this wind.
And I'm sure the first time he used that translation, he would have had a footnote or something explaining why he was making that translation choice. Yeah. The irony is, there's only at the very end, there's any reference to the fish. Around the last list of creatures that was given, which there were many, the last one said, and the fish of the sea. Until then, the fish.
They get mentioned, right? Or the mammals in the sea.
No, we're talking about fish of the sea. Mammals are not sea creatures.
I know, but the mammals in the sea aren't going to be worried by the flood.
I don't think that's the intention of the story.
Yeah.
But how come the fish do eventually figure into right towards the end of the story, but they're really not, because remember, these are not people that are really fishers. They're farmers. They've got sheep. They've got goats. They grow olive trees. Yeah, they're not really into marine life. And
they say that at the Creation Museum. I get one of the the big Noah's Ark Museum. Apparently, they get people coming up saying, "Well, where did the whale go?" The whale stayed in the water.
But isn't there? I read somewhere, I can't recall it, in the Jewish literature, there is an animal that dies.
You mean like the
in
Leviathan?
Torah.
You got Leviathan.
Yeah.
But and that's in the background of Genesis 1 as well. You've got the sea monster, which is a cross between the crocodile and a whale, probably. So the famous icon of St. George slaying the dragon, that has ancient roots. Like any religious place or religious story, it gets recycled from one religion, culture to another. So towards the end of the tradition, in the book of Revelation, Jesus, the Christ, comes on a white horse and slays the dragon. Now, that's not actually a Jesus job. He doesn't do that sort of stuff. But in the book of Revelation, he does. He's been conscripted into being the slayer of the dragon, the sea monster, Leviathan. It's all part of the job of being the savior of the world, apparently. And of course, in the local Palestinian and sort of Greek Orthodox church in the Eastern Mediterranean, St. George and the slaying of the dragon is the number one icon. And there'll be one in every church, as there are other things. But St. George is kind of a Hadra, as they call him, he's the big guy. He slays the dragon. But it's also the ancient Greek myth that you get at Andromeda, at the rocks of Andromeda off Joppa, and the idea of the Virgin being chained to the rock to feed the sea monster, so the sea monster will stop eating the townspeople. Okay, and then this savior figure appears on a heavenly horse, slays the dragon, sets the princess free, and depending on which version of the story, marries her or gives her back to her father. Okay. Now, if you trace those stuff back into the history of tradition, one element of that tradition this is one of the few times in my life where I get to talk about my doctoral dissertation. One of the elements of the story is that in the Delta irrigation valley, irrigation lands in Mesopotamia, what held civilization together were in fact the walls that were built between the different levee, the fields, the levee walls. And what was the biggest threat to that were the crocodiles that came up into those swamplands and ate the farmers and lolled around on the banks and destroyed the carefully created structures and took it back to chaos. And the role of the human was to control the dragon, get rid of the tanim, the crocodile, and maintain the levee wall so that the crops could still be grown and the town wouldn't starve. So these are primal images of chaos threatening civilization. And for people like the Israelites, the ocean was full of scary stuff. And the book of Jonah is like, the great fishing tale of all time. But I mean, it's the sea monster, the great fish that God has prepared. And in the apocalyptic literature, at the end of time, which always repeats the beginning of time, because that's what happens in mythic stuff. So in Genesis 1, God slays the sea monster to create the dry land and the heavens. And in the end of time, sort of apocalyptic scenarios, God has been storing Leviathan out in the desert somewhere until the end of time, at which point God will slay Leviathan and serve him up to the covenant people as their barbecue, as the messianic banquet. Okay, so these themes kind of wrap around each other and roll through different cultures and different times. Yes, it's interesting. There is no mention of sea monsters. In fact, the only reference to sea creatures is the fish right towards the end of the story. The fish were not in view, and there was certainly no thought to whales in that story. Okay, let me just push on. I'll go back to screen sharing. Obviously, the Creation Museum or the Noah's Ark Museum is not a kind of place I would take out a season ticket to enjoy. So is everybody seeing, including the folk online, seeing the PowerPoint slide now?
Yes.
This is very topical. This is exactly what we've been talking about in a way. This is the ancient cosmology, which is certainly there in the book of Genesis, but actually it's all through the Old Testament. And in fact, it's all through the New Testament. And it is also, of course, embedded in the creeds of the church. When we talk about Christ descending to the dead and ascending to heaven, this is the kind of universe which is being imagined. Okay, which is not the kind of universe we have, but that's the kind of universe which their observations made sense of. Okay, and what's happening in the flood story is that the work of creation in Genesis 1 is being completely undone. The separation of the firmament, the waters above the firmament, the waters below the earth, all that water that's out there just waiting to destroy us is allowed in, and creation is undone, which makes it all the more interesting, perhaps, that as part of the final conversation with Noah, the text in Genesis 1:26 thereabouts is being invoked and reiterated. So by the end of the flood story, creation is being put back in place. But it's like God has run around and unplugged all the plugs in the sky and under the earth and just let the place be flooded.
I wonder if that's related to this, the sons of God, the Nephilim coming in, like you've got spiritual beings breaking this clearly defined barrier against God's decision. God's clearly made this barrier between the spiritual creation and the physical creation.
Yes, but or maybe not. If it was so clearly that was not to happen, if that was so clear, and if the divisions were so permanent and so much in place, then the divine beings couldn't have come down. So if God is now, so look, we better put in place these extra provisions, that would suggest they weren't there until now, but we've just noticed a loophole. I mean, apart from that, we're dealing with
Like you're not allowed to go.
Yeah, but it doesn't say that in Genesis. It might say that in Ezekiel, it might say that in the book of Revelation, but it doesn't say it in Genesis. So in the world of the story of Genesis, are the angels doing anything wrong?
By inference.
Well, clearly it's not approved of, as it turns out, but in fact, I mean, apart from being totally bizarre, how can, with what we know of DNA and how the reproductive system works, angels can't have sex with women and produce babies. That doesn't happen. Just no way. Okay. But this is this is the way ancient people thought. And the heroes, whether it's the Greek world or the Mesopotamian world, the heroes were half-breeds. And they had human mothers, typically, because that's the delivery system to get here. A human father isn't much help. And they tended to have a divine father. And that's how you explain their extraordinary powers. And these are the heroes of the Greek legends. And they're the giants, the Nephilim of the book of Genesis, who of course get picked up in the apocryphal literature when they're into more esoteric kind of speculation. So it's like a funny, if this was an archaeological tell, we'd be saying, what have we got here? And what's this doing at this layer on the site? Like, where did this come from? It doesn't really fit in. There's been no mention of these creatures previously. They just suddenly pop into the storyline in chapter 6. But the book of the Watchers in First Enoch is a whole midrash on this scene and who these people were and what their job was supposed to be. They were the guardians. Well, they found some of the sheep that they were guarding way too attractive, kind of thing. So now, do we try to come up with some theological discourse that ties all that together as if there's actually something of substance and significance there? Or do we just say, gee, there's some pretty weird stuff in the Old Testament?
I was just thinking, imagine the boundaries and then like breaking the boundaries that acts as that.
Well, that's what we're saying after the event. But if the boundaries, like with Adam and Eve, apparently in the story, okay, there were boundaries set in advance. Help yourself for everything except that tree over there. There's nothing in this story at the time. You get it, I think, later on in First Enoch. They go into all these reasons why this was bad, and it's a breakdown of the separation. But there is no separation. In Genesis 2 and 3, there's no separation between heaven and earth. God comes down every afternoon for a walk in the garden because it's nice and cool down here, chats with people, hangs out together. And he has to get rid of Adam and Eve because if he doesn't, they will be just like us. That's not a big separation of heaven and earth. That's reflecting more the Greek idea of spirit and matter being totally different. That's a Hellenistic idea.
And then the fall marks that point of separation. Is that?
Well, is it a fall? As soon as you as soon as you use that language, you're buying into a particular theological interpretation of the story, which may have been the dominant interpretation of the story, but it's also a story, remember, that almost nobody in the Bible ever uses. So the Western Christian obsession with the fall may say more about Western Christian culture than about the Bible. Because it's not called a fall. That's our language from the Middle Ages or whatever. And had they not made that mistake, we would still be in the nursery called the Garden of Eden. And none of us would be adults. We're having a lovely time, but we wouldn't be fully human had we not used our free will to say no. Saying no to God, you could argue, is one of the first steps on the road to wisdom. Interesting, of course, for people in discernment, but do we say yes or do we say no to what we think God is asking of us? Okay. But yeah, and even there, God is not separate. God is still coming down. God provides clothes for them, and he later on with Cain and Abel, he puts a mark on Cain's head like the phantom stamp, so that nobody will pick on him. Who's going to pick on him? There's nobody else in the valley except his unborn brothers and sisters. And yet he goes off to build a city. These are not stories that cohere as regular historical kind of episodes, but they are stories that have motifs running through them. And in the Garden of Eden, there's a motif of what could have been and what it's like now. And of course, in the Cain and Abel story, you got the motif of the incredible murderous violence between agriculturalists and nomads. The people that have the sheep and the goats and the people that have the farms. That's a murderous dynamic that goes back thousands of years in human history. Without even talking about Jewish settlers and Palestinians. I mean, there's this dynamic between different groups of people. Noah, I mean, that little episode in chapter 6, which in a way, you could have the flood story, not have that there. The flood stories, but it's like the epitome of they're just running amok. But nobody told them not to, at least not explicitly. But it is a bad pun coming up. It's an undercurrent in the story that they shouldn't have been doing that. And yet later on in the books of Exodus and Joshua, the descendants of the Nephilim, the giants, are still around and still proving pretty powerful opponents. So, what's going on? So, yeah.
Can I take you back before we go break to the point you just made about the fall when you made that? It just reminded me of the reading you got us to do yesterday. What's your view on the Anderson book with the feminist interpretation, where he says it's more like a love story, it's a separating, it's not a fall. The story is a love story gone awry because in the fall their initial unity is separated.
That's a lovely romantic.
It is, isn't it? So you don't buy into it.
Oh, well, I don't have to buy into it. And I mean, there are different ways of reading the text.
Yeah.
And it's not that any way is equally valid.
Yeah.
But any way which is not toxic is probably okay.
Yeah.
We're not playing for sheep stations here, despite what.
And it is that toxicity that has just been bought into by a patriarchy dominant society for so many years.
Sure. And there were good social dynamic reasons for male supremacy. Farmers tend not to want lots of bulls. They like a herd of cows. They only want one bull, really. Same with sheep and so on. So, we're pretty dispensable, provided there's one of us around. The human race can continue. But if you have a shortage of women, there's no human race. Now, at what level are people just transferring their herd management practices to how they manage the human population? Bearing in mind, they also would have had the most tragic infant mortality rates and maternal death rates. And in the ancient world, right down to the time of Jesus and long past, down to the kind of places which are now being assisted by the Millennium Development Goals of a previous decade or two and the Sustainable Global Development Goals of the current period. These are places where 50% of all live births are dead within the year. 50% of the ones that survive the first year are dead before age of 5. And then those that make it to teenagers, certain percent, a significant portion of those are going to die because of misadventure, speeding chariots, taking drugs, whatever, stuff that teenagers do. That's half tongue in cheek. And so the life expectancy, so you produce lots of babies. There was no birth control, but there was a limit on the number of humans left in the village. and it was called disease, and it was called danger, warfare, violence, slavery. And so in the time of Jesus, and this would have been true right back in the time of any of these characters, roughly, let's say 65%, 2/3 of the population were peasants. 2% are in the ruling class, and they kill each other. They're poisoning each other all the time to be in charge, whatever. Around them, you've got the retainer class, which is priests and soldiers and bureaucrats, people like me, okay, that help make the system work because we bring our administrative and scholarly gifts to the job of making the system work. The priests were a slightly different category because they had a certain cachet that the administrators didn't have. The merchants are important, but they're a very small percentage, but they bring in the interesting stuff from India and West Africa, East Africa, whatever. You've then got, as I said, about 65% of the population of peasants, basically living hand to mouth. They have a bad season, they go into debt, and they never get out of debt. And then, of course, they go into, they sell their kids off, they sell their farm off, they sell themselves off, and they become landless ex-farmers that are driving the school chariot because they've got to get a job in town because they can't live on the farm anymore. Some of them become tradies. Well, they're not tradies, they're handymen. They're the people, the tecton, the people that do the technology, and they're the blacksmiths and stonemasons and so on. They have a function in a village, but they're not the tradies with a beach house on the coast. They're the people, they're the farmers that have lost their farm and are using their skills to scrabble a life together, but they have no chance of ever climbing back up into land ownership. There's only one way on the escalator of life in the ancient world. Below them are the expendables. They're the people working, say, in the jobs which made you ritually unclean, sort of tanners, that kind of thing, Simon the Tanner. And then there are the so you have the, I mean, I had the correct terminology for the last two categories, but there's the expendables and that was the outcasts, the unclean, and then there's the expendables. They're the ones that have just become bandits, and they're about 10% of the population, okay? Or they've been sent to work in the salt mines, they're going to be dead within the year, or they've been sent to work on the Roman galleys, they're going to be dead within the year because there's always more slaves coming through. Okay, now that's just like that was the cosmic world in which they imagined themselves to be living. The actual world in which they were living is the one I just described.
So, question, Greg, how many percentage-wise would be the slave population in the cemeteries in that area?
You might have noticed I didn't particularly mention slaves because slaves are found at all those levels.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
if I was a really lucky duck, I'd get a slave working for some rich dude who couldn't read and write, and he wanted me to be his basically the executive assistant and manage his estate for him, and I could live like a prince.
Right.
But I would be owned by him. I wasn't a freeman. Okay, I was a slave, and so there are certain things I can't do, like I can't own property, I can't own land, and so on. My children will be born as slaves. If I get on well with the master, he might eventually set me free, but I will still belong to his household. He never left the orbit of the powerful family to which you belonged, even if you became free. Okay, so there's this sort of social, so slavery, like gender, are two different other ways of slicing the population demographics of a pre-modern agrarian society. Women are found at all levels. Slaves are found at all levels, and occasionally a slave becomes the emperor. Not very often, through a coup, a military coup. Okay, but generally speaking, there's only one way, and it's down to the expendable pile at the bottom of society. So about 15% were in the elite, including priests, merchants, and retainers. 65% are in the great bulk of the population. So already that's about 80%. And the craftsmen and the outcasts and the expendables are about 20, are the remaining 15 or 20% of the population. And those figures held in Japan prior to the Meiji Revolution. They applied through the Ottoman Empire before modernization in the mid-19th century. They applied throughout lots of parts of Europe and other parts of the world, where wealth comes from agriculture, not from industry. Then owning land is what makes you powerful. And having people to work the land for no real payment is a really cool trick to maintain your wealth. Okay. Jesus, so far as we can tell, comes from the craftsman level of society. Joseph was the town blacksmith. Okay. He was the handyman you took your broken plow to, and he'd fix it. He's called a carpenter, probably because Ulysses is called a carpenter in the Odyssey and the Iliad. But he's actually the son of the Technon, the son of the smithy, whether that's a stonesmith, a silversmith, a blacksmith, or whatever. So Jesus' family probably didn't own any land, had no aspirations to ever move back up the social ladder. And Jesus' immediate ministry focus is on the other people like him, the peasants and the homeless, the people that have dropped through the safety net. So, and you can take that all the way back into this period. You can read it back into the book of Ruth, all kinds of other. It's just the way things are when wealth is generated by agriculture. Okay, we better stop and have a break for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and see what we can rescue. I was hoping to cover today. So have a break. I'll put the thing on pause. Firstly, I'll do that, and then I'll just go. When I find it again, recording, here we go. I'll put that starting the. Okay. So friends, I've just been over chatting with Sheila O'Brien about the problem some of us are having accessing the university library. And the really horrible thing is that it works for her, doesn't work for me, and doesn't work for Paul and maybe others. So one of the things apparently, which I had missed in the orientation program, is that because we're not fully integrated here into the UCLC library system that runs in Melbourne, we're not supposed to be able to log in directly through the university library website. To which I said, I was doing that as gregjenks.com, gregjenks@me.com, until you put me onto Greg Jenks, Southern Anglican Church, Southern Queensland. Suddenly it stopped working. So we're meant to be going into it through ARC. So, but see, in my case, I'm pretty sure that won't work. So let me, we've got a minute or so to play with here. Let me just, basically, we need to know anybody else who's having trouble getting into the library, we need to know, because then the email that Sheila is having at this moment with Rowan Edmonds, the head of IT, will make more sense. So when I go into, wait, I thought I had a big screen, but it's not big enough for this. So to get into the library, what we're supposed to do at St. Francis is log into ARC and then go in through library resources. Okay.
I have to be honest, that's the way I've done it, and I've had no problems going in that way.
Okay, so you're having no problem?
Yeah, but I've always gone in that way through ARC.
And when I try to do, so suppose I try to go onto a journal database or something, because I'm just that kind of student that I want to look up and get resources. So let's pick the Atla Religion database because it's the #1 pop with University Divinity students. If this works, I'm just going to walk it, and it works. Bloody hell. I have not been able to get in there for weeks.
Now you're in.
Now I'm in.
Hey.
Let me in.
So for me, Greg, I should go into the resource button rather than click on the link on the meta unit, correct?
Well, I'm not even quite sure what that means. Let me shut this. So when I was on the basic ARC page, okay, let me go back even further to when I first logged in. Oh, okay, it knows I'm already in there. This is going to be ugly now. Okay, so when I'm in here, let the Zoom thing get off my screen. Okay, where it's got library resources. That's how we're supposed to go in. Okay, here, library resource. And then Matt said that's what he's always done. And just do what Matt does. He gets it.
No, that
right. Okay.
Ask the emails from the lecturer if you do that.
It hasn't worked for me until now, but right now, doing it live. Now, maybe Rowan reset my password sometime during today, but just 3 hours ago, I couldn't get in, and now I'm in. So if you are having any trouble, and Paul, if you have any screenshots of where you get an error message saying your password is not correct, if you could screenshot that and send it through to Sheila, she'll use it as part of her email.
Okay.
There you go. Isn't life fun? I'm just going to get out of here so I've got a little bit less digital real estate happening. All right, so oh, that was recorded. That's jolly good. Go back into here. Okay, so we were previously talking about the sort of mental universe in which people thought they had, the structures of the universe, and then we started to segue into social structures. The next page was going to be an oral discussion led by one of the students on source criticism, but this is one of those weeks when nobody actually put their hand up to do that. So I have actually prepared some more material. We'll just flow through with that. And we're using the flood the flood along with Genesis 1 and 2, I guess. They're the two classic source critical passages, not the only ones, but they're the lay down misere kind of, look at this, you know. Yahweh here, or God here, Yahweh there, that sort of thing. So we're skipping that, but it'll come up in other ways. Okay, so before we get back into some of the questions about how sort of narrative and literary criticism works, let's have a little bit of think about hermeneutics. As I started saying earlier, hermeneutics is just really interpreting, making sense of, forming an opinion about something. And in the Greek New Testament, you'll often see a phrase, use such and such a word, which means, and that in Greek, it's hermeneo. That's the actual verb for to translate or to interpret. So I think and this is my theological worldview, I guess, I think one of the things I take as a given is that no subsequent theological interpretation of the text, no matter how wonderful it may be, will be the same as what whoever it was wrote it intended to say. To the extent that we can identify that, I find that interesting, but the message they had for their people 2,000 years ago is probably not going to be the message I will take out of the same material for Christian people living in Australia and a social democracy, etc., etc. And this is true of the wider phenomenon of translation. There's an Italian phrase, traditore traditore. The translator is a traitor. Every act of, and that's a bit cynical, but that's a sort of Italian proverb. When something is always lost in translation, as we say in English, particularly if it's a pun in the original language or some other cultural allusion that we don't have in our own culture. And, you know, a modern version of that is when Bible translators first went to PNG and they're talking about Jesus as the Lamb of God or whatever. We have pigs. We don't have sheep. Different culture. But we kind of hesitated saying, well, Jesus is the pig of God, because that has cultural for us. So, you know, this is the challenge of translating and translation. So the theological reflection point for me in all this is, so where do I think truth is located? Is the truth hardwired, as it were, into the actual Hebrew text, Hebrew word, Greek word, whatever? Now, there would have been a time in my spiritual journey where I would have said, yes, of course, because they're the words God dictated. They're the words God told them to write. And everything about that word, to the parsing, the part of speech, etc., everything matters. I think that's actually nonsense. And most humans who engage with scripture won't engage with it in the original language. And secondly, probably won't even have engaged with it as an act of reading. They will have heard the text. They won't have, well, through the Middle Ages, you know, millions of people never saw a book, never saw a Bible. They were way too expensive and they couldn't read anyway. So how does this stuff work as the word of God? Where is the truth located? Is it in a particular word? Is it in a story? Yeah. So I've already indicated back week one, for me, the story of the burning bush is an incredibly evocative story. I don't for a moment think it actually happened, but I think it's a fantastic story. And that's a story I will live into because it speaks to my kind of response to God, I guess. Is it the event? For some people, it's not, you know, but this really happened. And for some people, that'll be Old Testament events. Many people are a bit more relaxed about that, but they might get a bit more uptight if we question whether events in the Gospels actually happened as distinct from events in the Old Testament. There's a different tolerance factor for legend or whatever when it comes to our part of the Bible. Or is it actually truth is only to be found in Jesus, or truth is only to be found in God, or truth is something that's found when the people of God intentionally focus on trying to discern what's the wisdom God wants us to have? Now, I guess push comes to shove, that's where I'm at. But, you know, it's not that simple in everyday life. So the hermeneutics task will be run differently depending where we think the gold is in this mine. I work with a number of mining engineers who are wanting to improve their English, believe it or not. And so I have lots of analogies now about finding the main ore body and parts per million of concentration and mineralizing events and all kinds of stuff I'd never heard of until a few months ago. So in theological terms, what is it about Scripture? What's the key, or what's the heart of Scripture for us, and where are we going to be looking to make sense of it, to do hermeneutics? And so for me, every theological statement is provisional, including every theological statement in the Bible. Okay, but then I'm a bit more relaxed about what we mean by the Bible as the Word of God and so on. Some people would be a bit more cautious around that. And I think certainly when I'm preaching or when I'm engaging with people, I'm not so much giving them, well, here's what God wants you to do, here's the commandment or whatever, but rather I'm offering invitations for them to engage with God in their life. And I figure God can work it out with them as they go on their journey. But again, for some people, that's not black and white enough. Some people want more, they want it to be more definitive, more authoritative than what I've learned to live with a lot of ambiguity, not least because I look at myself in the mirror every morning and I say, yep, ambiguous, work in progress. So this is kind of background to that last section of my exegesis model, which is what I call the interpretation or the hermeneutic section. So wherever possible, I do want to try and figure out what was the original meaning of this passage when it first was shaped. You know, I'd really like to use a New Testament story. Jesus casting the demons out of the man in the sort of cemetery at Gadara. They all go into the swine, you know, the herd of pigs, and they rush down the edge of the hill and jump off a cliff, which isn't actually there, and drown themselves in the Sea of Galilee. What on earth? Why did they tell that story? What was the spiritual gold in that story? What's going on? And I've heard some powerful sermons on that passage, but what did it mean, you know, 2,000 years ago? When Mark's gospel becomes canonical, or Matthew or Luke's gospel become canonical, then I think it moves into a different, you get a kind of subtle shift in the nuance as to what a passage means. Because then, if you can think back to what it might have been like reading Matthew's gospel in Syria, Antioch or somewhere, you know, around about 100 CE, it was not yet scripture. It's an interesting document. In fact, we had an earlier version of it called Mark, but you know, this is a better version. It's got more stuff in it. Let's use this one. But it's not yet Bible. But within a couple of decades, it has become scripture. And presumably it starts to function, it has more authority. And when it says something, we pay attention more or something. I'm not quite sure what, but the canonical meaning. So the words of Jesus at the Last Supper over the bread and the wine, they're interesting parts of the story. But when that becomes the formula for the Eucharistic words in the canonical text, then the passage has changed its meaning. History interpretation is anything from as early as you can go back when the text is being seen as scripture, right down to what you read on the internet last week. So how have people of goodwill and good faith, how have they processed this stuff and made sense of it in various situations? And if, for example, we were doing the 10 Commandments, then what have we, well, there's a number of things about that, because it's actually 11 commandments in the 10 Commandments, but we know there have to be 10. Okay? So we all stand on our heads to count them differently, depending whether it's the Catholic version or the Lutheran version or the Anglican version. There are actually 3 different ways of getting to 10, because we know there has to be 10. Okay. But when that's canonical, because we know it's got to be 10 commandments, the Hebrew says, you know, Devarim Asherah, the 10 words. So as canonical text, it then becomes correct, infallible even. Like you can't mess with a canonical text in the way you can with just Mark's story of Jesus or something. But when it becomes canonical text, it's sort of protected document. There's an informal document management system kicks into place, and you don't mess with the text. What you've got to do is readjust how you interpret it in different situations. One of my colleagues from the Baptist Theological College in Perth, he did his PhD looking at textual criticism, which most of us would find somewhat boring. But he's looking at when people change the manuscript, that's actually reflecting how they're making the manuscript relevant to their community situation. They're not just making changes because they feel like changing the text. They're modifying the text so that it speaks to their community. But there comes a point you can't do that anymore. And so we have to adjust our interpretation. That's where the history of interpretation comes in. How has this text been understood by different kinds of Christians at different points in time? And then you can stand back, hopefully, and say, so this is what I think the meaning of this passage is. And that's probably the point at which a sermon starts to emerge in my mental process. Okay. And I'm not going to go through all those other layers with the congregation on Sunday morning. That's not what they're there for. They haven't come for a masterclass, even though I could give it, of course. They haven't come for a masterclass in biblical hermeneutics. They want me to break open the word and say something which is a prophetic word that speaks wisdom into their situation. On a good Sunday, that's what they're looking for. Other times they just want to wonder how long it's going to be because they've got to go somewhere. So that's the here and now is for us, for me, for us at this time in this place. What does this passage mean? And then the application, which may well come out in the sermon, although my sermons tend to ask questions about the application rather than tell people what the application is. So if that's what we think the passage means, then what are we going to do about it? Which is the application to life, to faith, discipleship, whatever. And that may be quite complicated, of course, as well. So that's my big picture kind of sketch of what's going on with hermeneutics. And that's not even allowing for the fact that, of course, if we're approaching it through different hermeneutical lenses, then that's going to prioritize certain aspects of this. If we're looking at it through, say, a feminist perspective or a post-colonial perspective, there'll be certain aspects of the story that jump out, or the text that jump out at us. And yet, if we're not paying attention to those lenses, which is why they're good to do, that stuff may not even, it may pass us by, not even notice that those elements were there until somebody says, but what about, because their life experience is interacting with the text in a different way.
That's the whole. I've read this for the last 60 years of my life, and it always has something different.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I read it from when I was a kid, sort of.
Yeah, and in my case, it's I've preached on these passages lots of times, but I can remember some of the ways I've preached on it in the past that perhaps I wouldn't do now. But then I'm not in the same church or the same community as I was then. So all of these things impact. And even between, like at the moment, I have a 5 p.m. Saturday Eucharist at Dunoon, 7:30 traditional Eucharist at St Andrews, and then a 9:30 whatever service. And even though I will have worked out a text now because I like to put it on the internet, and not because I need a text, and officially I'm kind of performing that arrangement of words, but it's different at 5 o'clock at Dunoon with 10 people sitting there from a more official liturgical kind of Anglican service to a more kid-friendly, family-friendly kind of thing at 9:30. So, and it was always like that. I would sometimes preach 3 times on a Sunday at different services, and the sermon would change. I often used to joke, you should come to the final service. I've worked it out by then, what I'm wanting to say. But it's reading people's eyes. It's knowing what's going on in that community this week, that sort of stuff. See, that's why I think you can't just reuse an old sermon. Okay. You might get ideas out of it.
Recognize it when that happens.
Well, yeah, and it's not good. Yeah. Okay. Any other so that's kind of background, I guess, not only to just general exegesis, but to that 4th assessment task, which is to do a theological essay, a hermeneutical essay from a particular perspective. And you're not going to be looking at form criticism or structure or whatever, but most likely, because they probably won't be relevant to this. Although I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. So you look, in a sense, you wanted to peel off some of the layers of the onion, but it's got to be scaled to the size of the job. I think what yours is, what, a 2,000 word essay, probably, I'm guessing from memory. Can't remember exactly, but yeah. Whatever it is, don't write a 5,000 word essay, or don't write a 500 word essay if it's a 2,000 word essay.
2,000.
Yeah.
Or bachelor's. Probably more for the masters.
All right, so let's duck back in then to the sort of source critical, or no, not so much source critical. Well, actually, this is about source criticism, but it's not called that. But I actually think it is very relevant to the question of source criticism, because it's to do with noticing the layers and the textures within a continuous story, which have often been seen as evidence or proof that older sources have been combined. But maybe they're just telling the story, and inadvertently or even quite deliberately, they're engaging in some repetition. And that may not be a sign of sources, even if it's a sign of layers. Let me just try and bring that down a tiny, yeah, maybe not quite that much, about there. Okay, so telling long oral stories, and of course I don't mean telling tall tales, I'm talking about long stories. Tall tale is a whole other concept. So Thomas Thompson, in his little book from the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament Supplementary Series, way back in '87, when I was still teaching at St Barnabas in Adelaide, he developed a way of reading basically all of Genesis and the first half of Exodus, really, with a particular kind of storytelling technique that he felt he had discovered and identified. And it's very much focused on the so-called Toledot structure. These are the generations of, that word Toledot, generations of. And that's led Thomas Thompson to totally abandon the accepted JEDP hypothesis, or the documentary hypothesis. But of course, being Tom Thompson, this is not somebody going back to his fundamentalist Irish Catholic roots. This is somebody going to a much more radical view of Israel's past and so on. He did his PhD on the names that are used in the patriarchal narratives, and then nobody would accept it because it was so radical. It was pointing out that all of these names, Abraham and Terah and so on, they're not second millennium BC names. We only find those names in the first millennium. Never, there's no evidence of anybody with those names in the second millennium. It was hot property at the time, and it took him a long time to get it published and accepted, and it took him a long time to get a proper job. For many decades now, he's been the head of the so-called Scandinavian school in Oslo, I guess. Anyway, that's Thomas Thompson. So this is a one paragraph from one part in his book. In studying the origin tradition, and that's the name of his book, The Origin Tradition of Ancient Israel. In studying the origin tradition, it's been necessary to depart wholly and entirely from the traditional documentary hypothesis. This is not your fundamentalist Old Testament lecturer at the Bible College, wherever. This is a very radical, progressive, out there kind of, head of, professor of Old Testament. He said, it's all wrong-headed. It doesn't work. And he goes on to say why. As it's interpreted today, the documentary hypothesis involves presuppositions of a pre-literary Grundlage, a layer, a ground layer, a basic layer existed before anything was written down, which was then developed on a series of historical developments of the tradition from the earliest J narrative through successive accumulation of variant traditions, J2, E, D, P, H, etc., and their redactions up to the final redaction of the Pentateuch as we know it. This departure has been necessary because the fundamental evidence for the documentary hypothesis is no longer sufficient to maintain such a radical interpretation of the narrative, and an interpretation which carries us so far away from the actual text. And the canonical text is what's on the page. It's not some hypothetical earlier reconstruction of something. The Bible is what's actually on the pages in the manuscript, not some pre-literary Grundlage. Now that would have made my very fundamentalist Bible college lecturers, their hearts would have leapt with joy until they read what Thomas goes on to say. Okay. But, and I picked this up in one of my books when I said that one of the hallmarks of Genesis is the occurrence of this Hebrew word, toledot, at 13 places in the book of Genesis. When it occurs along with a genealogy, so this is the genealogy of, and Abraham begat so-and-so and so-and-so begat whoever, that tends to wrap up a story. That tends to come at the end. But when it appears with no genealogy actually appended to that sentence, it seems to introduce a story, which will then conclude with another toledot statement, complete with the genealogy. Okay. And what I would suggest, this is in my future Bible, that if you take that as a clue, then you get a series of cascading long sections of Genesis that are in this kind of a structure. Okay, so the chapter 1 through to 2.3, 2.4 through to beginning of chapter 6, and 6:9 to end of 10 is the Noah story and the Babel story, and then there's the story of Abraham, and then the story of Isaac, and then the story of Jacob and his sons. What have I got down here? And why have I got a plus sign? Oh, that's just quoting me. Okay. Always good to cite your sources. Hey? Now, I find that a really interesting way to, once you move into a post-JEDP world, you're still seeing that there are groupings of material, but it's not the J grouping versus the E grouping versus the P grouping. There's groupings around a particular theme, particular character, and for the most part, they're really only J and E, with maybe obviously there's P for Genesis 1 and so on, but you're not going to find Deuteronomy. You're not going to find that this is a narrative material. So you're not going to find the priestly codes for dealing with leprosy or whatever. This is story material. And the priests had some stories, but the other material from the culture is also being drawn upon. Again, going back to Thompson, he then identifies this way of telling a story as it's a narrative. It's a complex chain, so it's like a whole lot of chain rings being hooked together. So it's complex, it's not just straightforward, and it's using traditional material. It's using building blocks that have been around for ages. But he says it has a clearly defined beginning and end. That narrative will have an independent theme and plot line, which makes sense within that chunk. That it's a fully conscious story, having its own interpretive context. Now that's beginning to move from objective to subjective, I guess. And then he has this other comment, which I highlighted for our purposes, and it requires its own exegesis. So that, for example, the story of Abraham offering Isaac, or almost offering Isaac on the altar in Genesis 22, has to be read within the whole Abraham story, not just within the chapter 22. It's a particularly vivid and dramatic episode, but it's an episode, a larger story with its own storyline, its own plot. And then he unpacks it a little bit. So I'll just reiterate it for those in case it's not too clear. The narratives of this genre. So he's claiming that he's actually identified a particular genre or form. All begin with a series of 3 episodes, which together perform specific functions in the chain narrative. They give the theme. They often give the context of the story that's going to follow. And particularly in the 3rd preliminary episode, they actually, in a sense, hint at what the final resolution is going to be. They give you a kind of a heads up, not explicit, but when you get to the end, you go, oh, that's sort of what they were talking about. Okay. And it's the 3rd of these episodes, which is usually of the greatest importance and will be found to echo through the others. Now, I guess I'm a hands-on learner or something. So just as I went home from College of the Bible and chopped up several copies of the Bible from the back of the church, stuck them into my exercise book. Years ago, when I first came across this, I sat down and thought, well, I wonder how that would work on some other bits of the Old Testament. So, and I put links to these up on the site, but just very briefly, this is the Exodus 1 to 15 story, and we'll come back to it when we get to the Exodus tradition and the flood, the Passover narrative. But when I looked at that, and I was just literally working through with an NRSV or whatever, I took the 3 paragraphs that basically make up chapter 1 as 3 opening episodes that kind of tell you what's coming. And actually, the fact that the midwives were having trouble and, having to stop so many baby boys being born and so on. That really sets up the theme in many ways, what's going to come. And then the way I've done it, then I've come up with the idea that Moses is the hero in this story. And so the first chunk of the hero survives the threat. Then the hero discovers who he is and what God wants him to do. Important part of going on the quest, obviously. The next one is the hero being told, no, it's okay, you can do this. Here's some special weapons or special tricks you can have in your back pocket, you'll be fine. And you've got Aaron, he'll come along to be your spokesman and so on. Because all of a sudden in chapter 4, Moses develops a speech impediment, which there's not been the slightest hint about until that point. And actually it seems to disappear after the flood, after the Passover narrative. So again, it's an element of the story that the hero has to have some inherent injury or liability or disability or whatever, which would normally rule them out, but because of God's power, they can do it. For me personally, it's engaging because for most of my young adult and adult life, I had really struggled with a speech impediment. So the idea that Moses was kind of, hey, look at this, he's fine. What's going on here? That's an element of the story that resonates with my own personal story. But I'm sure that's not the point of the Exodus story. Then the hero returns, he's come back to do what he's going to do. And you get one of the truly, truly weird stories in the Old Testament where Yahweh attacks Moses during the night and tries to kill him because he's not circumcised. So his wife, Zipporah, rips out a razor blade and circumcises him, and God's happy. I mean, that is a seriously weird story. Okay, but within the world of this kind of a narrative,
I mean, like it breaks up the flow of the narrative. Like it sort of.
No, it's seriously weird. Why should God care whether you got a foreskin or not?
The whole thing's weird, right? But yeah, I mean,
it's genital mutilation, but in our culture, you don't do that anymore. We just accept it. But here's God actually trying to strangle the guy who he's just commissioned to set the people free because he's still got a foreskin. Well, God could have taken care of that at some point. So it's just it's the idea of this mysterious, dangerous, sacred other and taboo. It's all that sort of stuff. I don't think you'll ever hear a sermon preached on Exodus 4. Any church we're likely to attend.
not in this time.
Okay. Not sure about other people's churches. Then the hero confronts the villain, who of course is Pharaoh. And then you've got a whole other really neat little story, which we'll come to later on when we get to this. But this is the actual the account of the plagues of Egypt, and we'll look at this in more detail. Then there's the great sort of climax at the end, where they leave and they cross the sea and everything's good, and Pharaoh's army is drowned and all the horses are dead. My girls at the pony club didn't really like that part of the story, and then the climax. Very mean horses.
They're mean horses.
The nasty horses.
Yeah.
What sort of theological judgment are you bringing to the world of the Egyptian horse? Eh?
Pleasing the girl.
Tongue in cheek. Tongue in cheek. Well, my daughters didn't like that story. And and then it's wrapped up by the sort of Song of Miriam, which is what we get in those last, just a couple of couplets, couple of sentences. You know, the horse and the rider, his cast, the Lord has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider is cast into the sea. Now, we will look at that in more detail when we get to the Exodus tradition and the Passover. But let's have another brief look at another example. So I then applied the same principle, basically, to the opening chapters of 1 Samuel.
That's not coming up on the
Yes,
screen.
I realise that would.
So now we've got to quickly turn this off, turn it back on. It's clunky, seriously clunky. Okay, so thank you. Participants can now see your application. So in the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel, I can just trying to shrink this back so you can see it, or maybe I'll just move that over to there. Okay. I thought, well, let's take Thompson's model, see if it works on these stories about Samuel in the first few chapters of the book of Samuel. So you've got an introductory triplet for the story in chapters 1 to 3. You've actually got an introductory triplet as well for the stories in chapters 4, 5, 6, 7. You get the development of the plot in the first one. Samuel becomes the liturgical assistant at the cathedral, and there's a little summary at the end. And then Eli and his sons have a bit of a problem, and the man of God turns up with an oracle about judgment on the house of Eli. And then in chapter 3, you get that classic scene of God calling to Samuel in the night, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." Okay. And then you get the conclusion where we're told that Samuel became a prophet, and none of his words ever fell to the ground, or something like that. And we get a similar kind of thing going on chapters 4 through to 7. And by the end, Samuel is not only a prophet, he's also a warrior. And frankly, there is no need for Saul. All you just need is another person like Samuel, you'll be fine. It's kind of, I'm arguing, what these two stories are saying. Okay. And then I think it's just on the next page. This is me doing the same kind of shtick to 1 Samuel chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15. The request for a king, warnings about you really don't want a king. I mean, really, that's bad news. People insist on having a king, and then you get Saul being nominated, Samuel's speech saying, "Don't be so stupid," Saul messing up pretty badly and showing that actually Samuel was right. He shouldn't have had a king. And then Saul disobeys Samuel. And then Samuel chops Agag to pieces in front of the altar of Yahweh. So he wasn't a retiring scholarly character. Okay. And then Samuel dies and Saul is in grief for his lost mentor. And that's a really powerful story when you see it in that way. It may not be the only way to structure the story. It may not have been what the original person had in mind, but it does show that you can kind of take Thompson's model, and you can see how this is a recognizable way of telling long, complicated stories, which have not just been made up on the spot, are often reusing traditional material, some of which is inconsistent with each other, but that doesn't mean we're dealing with source criticism. I mean, sources in a very generic sense, that there's stuff coming from different people, different communities, whatever, but not source criticism as in, well, I'm going to copy this paragraph and put it here, and that paragraph and put it here. How you going, Matt? You're looking troubled.
No, I was just trying to take a photograph of that, which I've done.
Oh, it's all on the website. I've already put it up.
Yeah, just it's easy to trip across. That's cool.
Okay. So I'm going to back out of here and try to get back into this thing. Okay. So what I see going on there, as I've been saying, we've got ancient stories. In this case, we started out with the flood, and I think the flood itself fits really well into that kind of thing. It's a story which has layers to it. the person weaving the story together, like a student writing an essay, may well have drawn on a quote from here and a quote from there. Of course, in that culture, you don't put quote marks and citation, but just as in, say, many Pacific cultures, when students come to study with us, they're kind of surprised at the idea that you have to write your own words. And it's not that they're lazy, it's just that in their culture, the best way to honor somebody is to use their words. You don't need to attribute them because everybody knows it's Uncle Fred or whoever. But so our Western things about, oh, you've got to acknowledge your sources, there's that word again, and you've got to give proper citation and so on. That's a cultural value that we have in Western, Anglo, German, whatever kind of culture. It may not be relevant at all in the ancient past. So I tend to sit lightly with the idea of source criticism, particularly when we don't have an extant copy of the supposed source. Very different, as I said last week, when you're looking at Chronicles, which is rewriting Samuel and Kings. You can see what they're doing, okay? But very different when the other source doesn't exist. And even in Joshua, particularly Samuel and Kings, the documents repeatedly say, so-and-so lived, he reigned from this time to that time. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. And for further details, see the annals of the kings of Judah. Well, of course, they don't exist anymore, so that doesn't help us. But it could well be that some of that material which is being used when the king is significant enough to get stories told about him rather than a pass-fail grade, that that could be stuff coming out of the annals. It's more likely to be the stuff the kings had recorded were victories and achievements rather than other adventures they got into that weren't so happy. And of course the Psalms themselves, and also the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, also refer to, sorry, not Song of Songs, Proverbs, Solomon, but Proverbs, and not Solomon, but you know what I mean, material attributed to Solomon. You do find references to different collections of material, particularly in the Psalms, the songs of ascent. It's a group of songs around a particular theme, and it's been brought into the Psalter as a block and so on. So I've no doubt that source criticism was one of the processes involved in forming the scriptures, but I have serious doubts that it ever looked much like JEDP. I think it was more about the story than about the paragraph or the source. So if that's helpful, might be. Let's go back to the flood, because we got sidetracked here talking about the cosmos and then the social structures. So if we're looking at the literary art, not the arc, the literary art in the flood story, and just doing a literary analysis, and this hopefully is not stealing thunder from next week, but hopefully giving an example of one of the things you do. You look at a passage, whether it's however long or short the unit seems to be, and you're going to ask questions about the literary aspects of the text. And one of the first ones is genre. What's the form? And in the case of the flood narrative, I wonder what you think the genre or the form of the flood narrative is. It's partly to do with the point of the story, but why would a story like that be told? And what is the genre which is being used in the flood narrative?
Myth.
That's like Aesop's fable, maybe. Style.
Well, it's a long story. It's a complicated story, but it's in essence it's simple. The gods got ticked off, decided to destroy everybody, but one way or another, one particular person was chosen to survive. Otherwise, none of us would be here. And so we're all descendants of Noah, according to that tradition. And then, the floodgates opened, the place was drenched, took ages and ages, then they all found dry land, they all got off and lived happily ever after. But why would you tell, what's the point of that story? Now, in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, you would certainly, there would be advantages, perhaps a point in having some kind of etiology, a story which answers the question, why do we have floods? But this is not that kind. This is a story about a super duper flood that was going to totally wipe out everybody.
Because it's not a warning, because at the end it says this is never going to happen.
That's right. At the end it says you're off the hook. Like I'm to blame. I shouldn't have done that. I should have gone to see my professional supervisor and kind of work through the anger issues I had with my parishioners. So there's this anticlimax in a sense at the end, and yet it is establishing a basic how to live with non-Jewish people, because the terms of the Noah covenant are about halal, basically kosher, that meat without you can eat meat, but it has to be meat with no blood in it. But surely that's not a good enough reason in and of itself for the flood story.
Then you could say, well, like, if everyone's descended from Noah, how can you then make those distinctions between Jew and non-Jew?
Well, they're not Jew and non-Jew in the case of Noah. Jews don't.
I mean, like coming back to it from later.
Yeah. True. And that's where the Table of Nations will come in chapter 10 as well, because that's where you get differentiation between different races and cultures and languages groups. So they're aware of that sort of difference. And actually Genesis 10 is a bit of a map of how at one point in history, how Israel understood its neighborhood, stealing the thunder for whoever's doing that in a week or so. But also in the I think even at the end of chapter 9, actually, which we didn't read all the way to the end, when Noah gets drunk and he's lying there naked and so on. And we got the curse of Ham, and he becomes the ancestor of the African people or the dark-skinned people. And then that turns into a racial trope about Negroes being cursed because they're descendants of Ham and so on. So there's some post-biblical stuff we need to deal with, but it's not necessarily in the biblical story. So, but in the storyteller's mind, the three sons of Noah represent the three great families of nations. Shem, of course, is the ancestor of the Shemites, Semitic people. Japheth is the Greeks and all the non-Semitic people, and Ham is the African people from Sudan and wherever, who were recognizably different. That's embedded in chapter 9. So they are beginning to be aware. We've got to live together. We don't yet have the covenant, the way the story unfolds. But certainly by the time you get to the book of Acts, the sort of Noah covenant is the basic minimum for Gentile Christians, at least keep the regulations from the Noah.
Peter makes a link between it and baptism.
Sorry?
Peter makes the link between, is that what you're getting at? With the Noahic covenant is like the ground level.
Yeah.
Like a Peter sort of.
Yeah.
Some other illustration.
Sorry, yeah. Peter in the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts, not First Peter. You mean Peter the character? Yeah. So in that story, they invoke the sort of Noah, that at least the Gentiles should do these things, not food that hasn't been strangled, the blood's been taken out, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see how at a much later period, the Noah covenant functions. But in the original shaping of Genesis, I think partly the flood story is simply that great turning point. It's almost the difference between the dream time and now. Back then, things were different. Things happened, all sorts of things. And because that's also a cultural memory from the Mesopotamian region, because we do have the sources. I mean, parallel don't mean sources, but we have surviving exemplars of various iterations of the flood narrative from Mesopotamia. So that gives us some confidence that at least the educated elite in Jerusalem, who had to deal with international relations and so on, and they had to learn other languages, well, you do that by studying their myths, studying their sacred stories. That's how you learn your language. So this is kind of cultural property which would be relatively widespread, particularly during the period that Jerusalem is under Mesopotamian control, which is the Assyrian period, the Babylonian period, and the Persian period. So that's roughly 700 to 300. So there's 400 years of, down to Alexander the Great, of cultural dominance by powers coming from Mesopotamia, Iraq, that sort of area. So presumably some cultural interaction going on there. And certainly after the story of the flood, by the time you get to chapter 10, we're moving into the world of the nations. Whereas the flood story, 5, 6, 7, 8, 6, 7, 8, 9, is kind of, well, that's how it all ended. So it's almost like the Garden of Eden story magnified. Like, it didn't work out so well. Back to ground zero, wipe everything out, start again. But now that is being expressed through patriarchal lineages and national, in inverted commas, because it's not the nation state in the modern 18th century, 19th century European concept, but the idea of peoples who have a distinct culture, a distinct language, an ethnic identity, and their own gods. And how do you live alongside those people? Yeah, so the flood story is kind of the end of the beginning in the book of Genesis. And then from chapter 10, 11 onwards, we're going to start talking about, well, in history, in the way it really works around here, this is how it works out. And it's about promises and covenant and so on. And of course, there's no, in the Abraham stories, they never invoke Adam, Eve, Noah, the Watchers, Tower of Babel. We finished that book. Now we go on with this story. And yet, for the person who'd left us the book of Genesis in its final form, that structure made sense. Okay, so it's a turning point. People don't live as long. The food sources change. So many fundamentals of human life are different after the flood than they were before the flood. So something around that. The structure is not too hard to understand. If you go through and map it out, you can see it developing. The warnings, the arrangements, the gathering of the animals. Actually, the animals gather themselves. Noah's not sent out to find 2 of these and 2 of those. They just kind of turn up and say, "Here's my ticket. Come on board, guys." And then the duration of the flooding, and then the gradual retreat of the floodwaters, and the multiple sending out of birds, all of which are elements of the cultural version of this story, which would have been reasonably well known in educated circles in the ancient world. And frankly, who's reading the book of Genesis? Well, not your average farmer at Hebron. People reading the book of Genesis or the Torah are basically the priests in the temple, because that's where people can read and write. The rest of Jewish society, they're not literate. This book has no point in existing until you have a scribal class, and then they're writing for each other. Just like people who publish books these days. Okay, the characters. Well, the big character is God, and the other big character, of course, is Noah. And nobody else really plays much of a role in the story because there are no other gods. There are no other heavenly powers. Even the Watchers, the angels, whatever, from the first part of chapter 6, they're AWOL. They're not involved in the flood story. They're part of showing how bad things had become. But God doesn't send angels to talk with Noah. He doesn't send angels to build the ark or shut the door, round up the animals, whatever. It's just God and Noah. Okay. All right. We get devices like, the so-called rules of 3 and rules of 7 and rules of 10 and 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, these are the telltale signs of a oral story that's been told over and over again. The setting, the timing, well, I think my working hypothesis, which I'd want, if I was going to get into this seriously, I'd want to kind of test out in some way, is to say, well, this story makes sense sort of during the Persian Empire, when what we call Judea, the province of Yehud, has been integrated into the Persian Empire, but has a lot of autonomy, a lot of self-governance. And the ruling elite from Yehud were thoroughly integrated into Persian culture. We know from the coins they were issuing by the time coins start to emerge in the 500s, they're issuing coins in Yehud, and they're perfectly normal pagan coins with the Persian gods and king and so on the coins and pagan symbols. So in that sort of world, young Jewish men with a career in the public sector, to use our language, had to know how to get on in a world where the empire is not Jewish. And I think the flood story, with the way it culminates with the Noah covenant, is providing a kind, if you like, a theological framework for living in a mixed culture. And yes, you can meet with your colleagues and you can share food, provided certain basic kosher rules are observed. But I can't imagine that point in the story had any resonance 200 years earlier, 500 years earlier. I don't think that was the agenda they were concerned with. So if I was trying to answer the question, what's the Sitz and Laban for the flood story, I'd probably say when Yehud is becoming a self-consciously Jewish ethnic state within a pagan empire. If you're not going to rebel every year, wear your pants backwards, refuse to eat pork, how are you going to make this work? You can't rebel year after year after year. And that probably answers the question about intended audience, because it's probably the kind of people writing the story are actually the audience. We will wrap it up in a minute, so we won't go into all this. But as always, the task, I think, is then to say, well, where do we find spiritual wisdom in this case, in Genesis 6 to 9? And we've been mostly focusing on the sort of literary aspects. We've occasionally referenced the fact that we don't think of the world as a 3-tiered universe, and we don't think of Jesus traveling up and down between the different layers and so on. Interestingly, the story is mostly ignored in the rest of the Old Testament, but I do just want to read you this. There's a fascinating passage. There's a passage I find fascinating in Ezekiel chapter 14. Okay, and so I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to try and get it on the screen, and in Ezekiel 14, a number of elders come to Ezekiel the prophet and sit down before him, and God is saying, don't listen to these guys. They've got idols at home. They're not really kosher. Okay. And the bit that's interesting, around about verse 14, I guess repeated 2 or 3 times later in the chapter. So, and it's one of those passages where Adam, mortal, is being used. Okay, mortal, I would say. So I'll start at verse 12. The word of the Lord came to me, mortal, Adam, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and break its staff of bread, in other words, it's the stick that it's been leaning on, and I send famine on it, and I cut off from it human beings and animals. And then this absolutely fascinating sentence, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, these 3, even if all of them lived in that land, they would only save their own lives by their righteousness. They would not be sufficient to save the city or to save the country. Even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, and the same thing occurs a couple of verses later. I think it's 2 or 3 times. So to me, there's 3 interesting characters. Noah, the flood character, Job, this weird guy. We have a book about Job, and he's this astoundingly wealthy and super pious guy from the land of Nod. We have no idea where that is. It's an incredible story, but he's famous. So in the case of Noah, he's famous for, in the biblical tradition, he's famous for his virtue. He found favor before God. That also tells us by the time of the prophet Ezekiel, the flood story featuring Noah is in circulation and has become proverbial. Interesting. Job, incredibly righteous guy, bit of a pain to go out with, but an incredibly self-righteous and observant and careful kind of guy who nonetheless gets pummeled, loses everything. And then Daniel, who doesn't even exist yet, according to the Old Testament story. Okay, because he's a story from the time of after Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, really, the book of Daniel is almost certainly a book from the Maccabean period. But Daniel turns out to be a very important legendary figure in Canaanite religion. So you've got 3 characters, Noah, Job, Daniel, referenced 3 times, I think it is, in Ezekiel 14. And which tells us that the Daniel figure was up there with Job and Noah long before the stories of Daniel and the burning furnace and lion's den and all that stuff. Daniel is a thing, he's a meme in the ancient world. So is Job, and so is Noah in the book of Ezekiel. So that's one of the few times that the character Noah is referenced elsewhere in the Old Testament. And I find it a really fascinating intertextual kind of moment. Who are these? I mean, is that Noah, our Noah? Probably, because there's nobody else with that name in the Old Testament. But what's Ezekiel? Well, what's God saying to Ezekiel? You could have Noah and Job and Daniel in your village. It won't save you. I'm going to punish you anyway. Which at another level is the story of the flood. Noah's righteousness was not enough to save any more than the immediate members of his family, which is not really a family in the Middle East. Your wife and your sons and their wives, that's not your family. The family is, much bigger than that. There are some other examples. You can look them up. They do crop up a couple of times in the Apocrypha. And of course, we get some examples. And where it says H-E-R, that's meant to be H-E-B, obviously. Hebrews, not her, the book of her. So, so these stories do have their own afterlives within the text and, of course, outside the text. And even if we can't work out what the original point of the story was, somebody thought it had a point because they went to the trouble of spending what we call 3 chapters on this story. Tower of Babel gets one chapter, half a chapter really. So relatively speaking, the flood story is a major element in the story, in the opening chapters of Genesis. You've got chapter 1, you've got chapter 2, 3, you've got 6, 7, 8, 9, and then you've got the Tower of Babel in chapter 10. So this is a big bookend. It's a big chunk of text. And even if we can't work it out, someone thought, this is really important. It has to go into my essay. No, I can't leave this out. It's got to be there. All right, so we'll wrap it up there. It's just hitting 5 o'clock up here and 6 o'clock in Hobart. So thanks everybody, and look forward to some ongoing conversation and discussion as we unpack some of this on the ARC site days ahead. If there are people that are interested in doing a kind of a walkthrough on some aspect or other of accordance, perhaps we could use the discussion forum to work out what those topics might be, and then we can look for a time in a week or so when I can find an extra hour or half an hour in a couple of weeks. We'll just do a little workshop on those. Okay.
That'll be a Zoom thing, do you think?
It'll be a Zoom thing. Yeah. Because I'm down in
Shadow
Lisbon.
Languages was ages ago, and it's fallen in my head.
That you,
Oh, so, I mean, a month ago, I was saying to Eve, geez, I used to be the accordance kind of guru at St. Francis College. I haven't used this for 10 years. I've got to relearn how to use this. So I think I'm doing okay, but it made a big blue.
oh, that video you did was very good.
Okay, the
Watch that through.
one from orientation day or word study?
Maybe it was. There's one on our week 1 or our welcome, one of the pages.
That's the exegesis guide.
The word study. The word study.
Word study. So yeah, same.
That was very good.
Okay, I'm stopping the recording. You can now